Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom? My son said it with a smile, his arm wrapped around my shoulders as if he were proud of me, as if he were doing me a kindness. And for a moment, the room responded exactly the way he expected. A few polite laughs, a couple of raised eyebrows, and that subtle shift in attention that always happens when something personal is said just loudly enough for others to hear. I stood there in the middle of his Christmas party, surrounded by people who had known me for years, people who had once asked me for advice, who had once treated me as someone whose presence carried weight, and I felt the change before I saw it. The quiet recalibration of how I was being perceived, not as Evelyn, not as someone who had built anything of her own, but as the mother who was being taken care of, the one receiving help, the one living off her son's success. I did not move, not because I was frozen, but because I understood something in that exact moment that no one else in the room did, something that made any immediate reaction unnecessary. And instead, I allowed his words to settle into the space, to take their full effect. Because once something like that is said, once it is heard and accepted, it begins to shape reality in ways that cannot be undone by simple correction. Laura was standing nearby holding a glass of wine, her expression composed but unmistakably satisfied, and she did not need to say anything, because the narrative had already been delivered. Clean and efficient, placed exactly where it would have the most impact, and I could see it working, the way people glanced at me just a little differently now. The way their smiles carried a hint of something else, something softer, something that bordered on pity. My son gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze, as if to emphasize his point, as if to reinforce the image he had just created, and I turned my head slightly to look at him, not with anger, not with confusion, but with a calm awareness that he did not yet recognize, because he believed this moment belonged to him. He believed he had defined it, controlled it, shaped how it would be remembered. I smiled back, not broadly, not in a way that invited more conversation, but just enough to acknowledge the moment without challenging it, because challenging it would have required me to explain something that was not meant to be explained here, not in this room, not in front of people who were already beginning to accept what they thought they had just learned. The music continued, the soft hum of conversation gradually returning as the moment passed, and yet nothing had actually returned to what it was before, because once a perception is introduced, it lingers. It reshapes everything that follows, and I knew that by the end of the night, the story would already be spreading in quiet ways, in side conversations, in subtle assumptions, in the way people would speak about me when I was no longer standing in front of them. I stepped slightly away from him then, not abruptly, not drawing attention, and I picked up a glass from the table nearby, holding it lightly in my hand, as if everything was exactly as it should be, because in a way, it was. This moment was not an accident. It was a reflection, not of me, but of what he believed. And what he believed would matter far more than what he said tonight. I watched him move through the room, confident, relaxed, greeting guests who admired him, who saw him as successful, generous, someone who took care of his mother, and I realized that what he had given them was not just a sentence, it was a story, one that placed him in a position of quiet authority and placed me somewhere beneath it. And I understood then that the real shift had not happened in what he said, but in what everyone else chose to believe. I took a slow breath, letting the noise of the party settle around me, and I allowed myself one brief thought, not of disappointment, not of anger, but of clarity. Because what had just been revealed was not something new. It was something that had been building quietly, something that had gone unspoken until now, and I knew with complete certainty that while they believed they understood the truth behind those $5,000, They had no idea that the truth itself had never belonged to him in the first place. I did not stay near him for the rest of the evening, not because I needed distance, but because proximity would have suggested that I accepted the version of me he had just presented, and I had no reason to reinforce something that had already been said. Instead, I moved through the room slowly, greeting people as I always had, exchanging quiet words, listening more than I spoke, and I could feel it in every interaction. The slight hesitation, the careful tone, the subtle adjustment in how they addressed me, as if they were now measuring their words differently, as if they had been given new information that required them to reposition themselves in relation to me. One woman, someone I had known for years, touched my arm lightly and said something about how wonderful it was that my son took such good care of me. Her voice warm but softened in a way that carried an assumption I did not correct, and I smiled gently, not agreeing, not disagreeing, because correction in that moment would have turned something simple into something uncomfortable, and discomfort was not necessary, not yet, across the room. I could see Laura speaking with a small group, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, and every so often her eyes would flick toward me, not directly, but enough to confirm that she was aware of where I was, aware of how the evening was unfolding, and there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, the kind that comes from believing a narrative has been successfully established. My son moved easily between conversations, shaking hands, laughing, playing the role he had built for himself. And I watched him not with judgment, but with a level of clarity that had not been required before tonight. Because what he had done was not simply a careless remark. It was a declaration of position, a statement about how he saw himself in relation to me, and more importantly, how he wanted others to see it. As the evening continued, small details began to stand out more clearly. The way certain conversations lowered in volume when I approached, the way others shifted direction entirely, and none of it was overt. None of it was unkind in any obvious way, but it was present, undeniable, the quiet result of a single sentence, repeated silently in the minds of everyone who had heard it. I stepped outside for a moment, the cool air offering a brief contrast to the warmth inside, and I stood there alone, not overwhelmed, not hurt, but observant, allowing everything to settle into place, because understanding requires space, and space is something I have always known how to give myself. My phone remained still in my hand. No messages, no interruptions, just the steady quiet that allowed my thoughts to move without distraction. And I considered what had changed, not in terms of emotion, but in terms of structure. Because structure is what defines reality long after words have faded. When I returned inside, nothing appeared different on the surface. The music continued, the laughter carried on, and yet the foundation of the evening had shifted entirely, even if no one was acknowledging it openly. I picked up my coat a short while later, not announcing my departure, not drawing attention, because leaving quietly often reveals more than staying ever could. And as I stepped toward the door, I glanced once more across the room, taking in the scene exactly as it was, knowing that by the time the night ended, the version of me that had been created here would already be firmly in place in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. But I also knew something else, something none of them had considered, something that had never needed to be spoken aloud. And as I walked out into the night, I understood with complete certainty that while they believed they had just learned the truth about me, they had only been given a story. And stories, no matter how convincing, do not change what has already been built. The house was quiet when I returned that night. Not in a way that felt empty, but in a way that allowed everything to settle without interruption. And I moved through it slowly, placing my coat in its usual place, setting my glass down on the kitchen counter, letting the familiar rhythm of small actions restore a sense of order that had never actually been lost. I did not turn on the television, did not reach for my phone, because noise would have distracted from something far more important, the clarity that comes when a moment reveals more than it intends to. And I stood there for a while, looking out into the darkness beyond the window, replaying nothing, because there was nothing to replay, only something to understand. What my son had said was not spontaneous, not accidental. It had been chosen, shaped, delivered with just enough ease to make it seem natural. And that meant something far more significant than the words themselves. It meant he had been thinking about this, about how to position himself, about how to define me in a way that supported the version of reality he had already accepted. My phone buzzed then, a soft vibration against the counter, and when I glanced at the screen, his name appeared. Not unexpected, not urgent, just present. And I let it ring once before answering, giving myself a moment to recognize what I already knew, that this conversation would not be about apology, not yet, but about reinforcement. His voice was relaxed, almost casual, asking if I had made it home safely, as if the evening had passed without consequence, as if what had been said had not carried any weight beyond the moment itself. And I answered simply, confirming that I was home, offering nothing more because more was not required. He continued, explaining lightly that everyone had enjoyed the party, that it had been a good night. And I listened, not interrupting, because interruption would have shifted the tone into something more direct, something he was not yet prepared for. And I understood that what he needed in this moment was confirmation that his version of events remained intact. When he mentioned the comment he had made, he did so briefly, almost as an afterthought, framing it as a joke, something harmless, something that had simply been taken at face value, and I could hear the expectation in his voice, the quiet assumption that I would agree, that I would minimize it, that I would allow the narrative to remain exactly as he had presented it. I did not correct him, not because I accepted his explanation, but because correction would have given the moment a significance he was not yet ready to face. And instead, I acknowledged what he said without validating it, keeping my tone even, my words measured, allowing him to hear nothing that would challenge his certainty. There was a brief pause then, a small gap where he seemed to be waiting for something more, perhaps a reaction, perhaps reassurance, and when it did not come, he shifted the conversation slightly, asking if I needed anything, if everything was comfortable, reinforcing the role he had placed himself in, the one who provides, the one who supports, and I recognized that for what it was. Not generosity, but positioning. I answered calmly, telling him that everything was as it should be, and in that statement, I allowed him to hear what he wanted to hear, even though it did not mean what he thought it did. When the call ended, the silence returned just as it had been before, steady and undisturbed, and I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly against the counter, considering not what I would say next, but what needed to be done, because words had already been used, stories had already been told, and what comes after stories is not more conversation, it is structure. I turned off the kitchen light then, letting the house settle fully into darkness, and as I walked toward my room, I understood with complete certainty that while my son believed he had defined our relationship with a single sentence, he had only revealed how little he understood about the foundation it was built on. The next morning did not bring urgency, only a quiet clarity that settled in gradually, the kind that does not demand attention but changes everything nonetheless, and I moved through my routine as I always had, preparing my coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light fill the room without distraction, because routine has a way of revealing what remains unchanged, even when perception has shifted. I thought about his words again, not to relive them, but to understand the intention behind them, Because intention is what defines structure, and structure is what determines everything that follows. And it became increasingly clear to me that what he had presented to that room was not just a misunderstanding, it was a belief. Something he had accepted fully, something he had built his confidence on, and that belief had not formed overnight. I sat at the table for a while, my hands resting lightly around the warm cup, considering the path that had led to this moment, not with regret, not with frustration, but with a level of objectivity that only comes when emotion is no longer necessary. Because emotion clouds detail, and detail is what mattered now. My phone remained still, no messages from him, no attempt to revisit the conversation. And that silence told me more than anything he could have said. Because silence, when it follows something significant, often indicates certainty, the kind that does not feel the need to question itself. I stood and walked into the study, a room that had remained unchanged for years, its contents orderly, deliberate, each document placed exactly where it belonged. And I opened the drawer without hesitation, retrieving a file that had not needed to be touched in some time, not because it was unimportant, but because its importance had always been understood without needing to be revisited. I placed it on the desk and opened it slowly, not searching for anything new, but reaffirming what had always been there. The structure, the agreements, the decisions that had been made long before my son ever stood in that room and defined himself the way he had. The pages were familiar, the details precise, each line carrying weight, not because of what it said, but because of what it established. And as I reviewed them, I did not feel the need to change anything, because nothing had been altered, nothing had been compromised. Everything remained exactly as it had been designed to remain. I closed the file and rested my hand on top of it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because what I was holding was not just documentation, it was clarity, the kind that does not need to be explained to be effective. Later that afternoon, I made a call, not out of reaction, not out of urgency, but because timing matters when clarity has been reached, and when the voice on the other end answered, I did not waste words. I simply stated that it was time to review everything in person, and the response was immediate. Calm, understanding, because there are conversations that do not require context, only acknowledgement. I ended the call and returned the file to its place, not hiding it, not protecting it, but simply returning it to the order it had always belonged to. And as I moved back through the house, I understood with complete certainty that what had begun at that party was not something that needed to be corrected through words or explanation. It would be corrected through something far more precise, something that could not be misunderstood once it was seen. And that moment, unlike the one my son believed he controlled, would not rely on perception, it would rely on truth. The office was exactly as I expected it to be. Quiet, orderly, untouched by anything outside its walls, and when I stepped inside, there was no need for introduction, no need for explanation, because the purpose of this meeting had already been understood the moment I made the call. He greeted me with a nod, professional but familiar, and gestured toward the chair across from his desk, where a set of documents had already been placed with deliberate precision, not newly prepared, not assembled in haste, but arranged as something that had been waiting, something that had always existed in its current form. I took my seat and rested my hands lightly in front of me, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, because there are environments where stillness is not passive, it is intentional, and for a brief moment, neither of us spoke, allowing the quiet to settle into its proper place before anything else was addressed. He opened the file and began without delay, not offering commentary, not framing the discussion in emotional terms, but presenting the structure exactly as it was, each element defined clearly each detail placed in context without the need for interpretation. And as he spoke, I listened without interruption, not because I was hearing this for the first time, but because repetition reinforces certainty, and certainty is what removes doubt from everything that follows. He outlined the flow of assets, the origin of the accounts, the agreements that had been established years ago, long before my son had ever stepped into the position he now believed he held. And with each point, the distinction became sharper, not between right and wrong, but between perception and reality. Because what had been assumed by others was not supported by anything that existed within these pages. I did not ask questions, not because there were none to ask, but because every answer was already present, clearly defined. And I had no interest in altering what had been built, only in confirming that it remained exactly as it should. When he reached the section that connected everything, the part that established control and authority beyond any misunderstanding, he paused briefly, not for emphasis, but to ensure that what was being presented was fully acknowledged. And I gave a slight nod, because acknowledgement, in this setting, carries more weight than any spoken agreement. We moved through the remaining details with the same steady pace, no urgency, no deviation. And when he finished, he closed the file with the same precision he had opened it with, leaving it resting between us as something complete, something that required nothing further to validate it. He asked if I wished to make any changes, if recent events had introduced any need for adjustment, and I answered simply, no. Because recent events had not altered the structure, they had only revealed how it was being misunderstood. And misunderstanding does not require correction through change. It requires clarity through exposure. We discussed timing then, not in terms of reaction, not as a response to what had been said at the party, but as a matter of sequence, of when information would be presented, of how it would be introduced in a way that allowed it to stand on its own without explanation, because explanation invites debate. And this was not something that could be debated. When I stood to leave, there was no sense of conclusion, no feeling that something had ended, only the quiet recognition that everything was already in place. And as I stepped back into the outside world, the contrast was immediate, the movement, the noise, the unpredictability of it all. And yet none of it carried any weight compared to what had just been reaffirmed. I returned home without distraction, the file no longer in my hands, but present in my mind, with complete clarity. And as I walked through the familiar rooms once more, I understood with absolute certainty that what my son had presented as truth was only ever a reflection of what he believed. And what would come next would not challenge that belief directly. It would simply replace it with something undeniable, something that did not rely on words or perception, but on the kind of reality that reveals itself fully the moment it is seen. The invitation was sent without emphasis, just a simple message confirming a small family gathering the following weekend. Nothing formal, nothing that would suggest anything beyond what had always been expected, and I knew they would accept without hesitation. Because routine is rarely questioned when it appears unchanged. The house was prepared as it always had been, the table set with care, the same details in place that had defined countless evenings before. Because familiarity creates comfort, and comfort lowers attention. And I had no intention of disrupting that until it was necessary. They arrived together, on time, carrying the same composed expressions they had learned to maintain over the past few days, polite, measured, and just slightly cautious, as if aware that something had shifted but not yet certain where it had settled. My son greeted me with a brief embrace, his tone warm but controlled, his words careful, and I returned the gesture with the same calm steadiness. Not reinforcing anything, not resisting anything, simply allowing the interaction to exist exactly as it was. Laura followed, her smile present but restrained, her posture more deliberate than before. And I noticed the difference immediately, not as weakness, but as awareness, the kind that comes when certainty has been replaced by something less defined. We sat together at the table, conversation beginning in familiar ways, light topics, shared updates, the kind of dialogue that fills space without requiring depth. And I participated just enough to maintain the rhythm, not withdrawing, not leading, because this moment was not about direction, it was about observation. As the evening progressed, I could see the subtle effort in both of them, the way they chose their words, the way they avoided certain topics, the careful navigation around anything that might lead back to what had been said at the party, and that avoidance was not accidental, it was intentional, a quiet acknowledgement that something remained unresolved, even if they did not yet understand how to address it. At one point, my son mentioned finances in passing, a brief reference to a recent investment, and I noticed how quickly Laura glanced at him, how quickly the subject shifted, and it confirmed what I already knew, that the structure he believed in was still intact in his mind, still guiding his confidence, even if it had begun to weaken. I allowed the conversation to continue without interruption, not correcting, not redirecting, because interruption would have drawn attention prematurely, and timing, as always, mattered more than reaction. When the meal ended, I stood and moved toward the study, not announcing my intention, not inviting them directly, but leaving the door open just enough for the shift to occur naturally, and after a brief moment, they followed. Not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, the kind that arises when something is sensed but not yet understood. The room was quiet as they entered, the same order, the same arrangement, everything in its place, and I gestured lightly toward the chairs without speaking, allowing them to settle before anything was said. My son looked around briefly, his expression neutral but attentive, while Laura remained still, her gaze more focused, more searching, and I took my seat across from them with the same calm presence I had carried through everything else, because this moment did not require force, it required clarity. I rested my hands lightly on the desk and looked at them both. Not with expectation, not with challenge, but with a quiet certainty that needed no reinforcement, and in that silence, I understood with complete precision that what they believed about me, about themselves, about everything that had been said was about to meet something that did not depend on belief at all, something that would not need to be explained once it was seen. And that moment, unlike the one at the party, would not leave room for interpretation. I did not begin with explanation, because explanation invites resistance. And resistance only delays what is already certain. So instead, I reached forward and opened the folder that rested quietly on the desk, turning it toward them without emphasis, without any shift in tone, because what was inside did not require introduction. My son leaned slightly forward, his expression still composed but now more attentive, as if he sensed that this moment carried a weight different from anything that had come before, and Laura remained still beside him, her posture controlled but her gaze fixed more intently than before, searching for something she could not yet define. I slid the first document toward them slowly, not as a gesture of confrontation, but as a simple act of placement, allowing the page to rest where it could be seen clearly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because reading requires a different kind of attention, one that replaces assumption with detail. My son's eyes moved across the page, steady at first, then more focused. The confidence he carried earlier in the evening beginning to shift, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know what to look for, but in small ways. The tightening of his jaw, the slight pause before moving to the next line, And Laura's gaze followed soon after, her expression changing even more subtly. The kind of change that happens when understanding arrives before acceptance. I did not interrupt them, did not guide their attention, because guidance would have suggested that interpretation was needed, and it was not. Everything was already there, defined, structured, precise. After a moment, I placed the next document beside the first, aligning them carefully, not out of habit, but out of intention. Because clarity is reinforced through consistency, and I allowed the sequence to unfold exactly as it had been designed to, each page building upon the last, each detail removing another layer of what they had believed. My son finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. Not challenging, not dismissive, but uncertain in a way I had not heard from him in years. Asking a question that was less about the document itself and more about how it could possibly exist in the way it did, and I answered simply, not expanding beyond what was necessary, because the structure did not change based on how it was questioned. It remained exactly as it was, regardless of his understanding. Laura did not speak at first, but I could see the shift in her posture, the slight forward movement, the way her attention sharpened as she began to connect what she was seeing with what she had once believed. And that moment, that quiet realization, carried more weight than any reaction she could have expressed. I placed the final document in front of them then, not with emphasis, not with any change in expression, and allowed the silence to settle again, because silence, when paired with truth, does not create confusion. It creates clarity. My son leaned back slightly, his gaze no longer fixed on the pages but somewhere beyond them, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of reality that could no longer exist at the same time. And Laura finally spoke, her voice lower, more controlled, asking not about the details, but about what it meant for everything they had assumed, everything they had said, everything that had been built on those assumptions. I looked at them both, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with the same calm certainty I had carried from the beginning, and I answered in the simplest way possible, because simplicity leaves no room for distortion. Telling them that nothing had changed, nothing had been altered, everything had always been exactly as it was written there, and that what they were seeing now was not something new, it was something that had always been true. The room remained still after that, not tense, not uncertain, but settled in a way that could not be undone. And I understood with complete clarity that the moment had arrived, the moment where perception no longer held authority, where assumption no longer shaped reality, and where what had been quietly established long ago now stood fully visible, requiring nothing further from me to be understood. No one spoke immediately after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because anything said too quickly would have diminished what had just been understood, and I allowed that silence to remain untouched, giving them the space to process not just the documents in front of them, but the collapse of the version of reality they had carried into this room. My son shifted slightly in his seat, his posture no longer defined by ease or confidence, but by something more measured, more aware. And when he finally looked up at me, there was a difference in his expression that had not been there before, not fear, not even regret, but recognition. The kind that comes when something can no longer be dismissed or reinterpreted. Laura closed the folder slowly, her hands steady but deliberate, as if the act itself required more thought than it should have. And she glanced toward him briefly before looking back at me, not searching for confirmation anymore, but acknowledging what she had already understood. I remained still, my hands resting lightly against the desk, not pressing forward, not reinforcing anything, because reinforcement would have suggested that the truth needed support, And it did not. It had already established itself completely. My son spoke then, his voice quieter, stripped of the casual tone he had used at the party, asking how long this had been in place, and I answered simply, not adding emphasis, not expanding beyond what was necessary, telling him that it had always been there, long before he had ever described it any other way, and that answer, more than any explanation, settled something within him that could not be undone. Laura asked no questions this time, and that absence carried its own meaning, because there are moments when understanding does not require further detail, only acceptance. And I could see that she had reached that point, not comfortably, not easily, but completely. The room remained quiet for a few seconds longer, and then my son leaned back again, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement, as if he were adjusting to a position he had not realized he was standing in, and I watched him without judgment, because judgment would have added something unnecessary to a moment that was already complete. I closed the folder gently and placed it back in front of me, not taking it away, not reclaiming it, but returning it to its place within the structure it represented. And as I did, I understood that what needed to happen next would not come from anything I said, but from how they chose to move forward with what they now knew. Laura spoke once more, her voice softer, more controlled, asking what this meant for everything ahead, and I looked at her with the same calm certainty I had carried from the beginning, answering in a way that left no space for misunderstanding, telling her that nothing had changed, that everything would continue exactly as it had been designed, because structure does not adapt to perception, it remains constant regardless of when it is understood. Neither of them responded to that immediately. And in that silence, I saw the final shift take place, not in their words, but in their awareness. The quiet acceptance that what they had believed was no longer relevant, and that what stood in front of them now was not something they could influence, only recognize. I stood then, not signaling an end, but acknowledging that the moment had reached its natural conclusion. And as I moved toward the door, I did not look back, not because I was leaving anything behind, but because there was nothing left unresolved in that room. And as I stepped out into the quiet of the hallway, I understood with complete certainty that the truth, once revealed in its full form, does not require repetition. It simply remains steady and unchanged, shaping everything that follows, without needing to announce itself again. The days that followed did not return to what they had been, but they did not fracture either. They simply adjusted, quietly and without announcement. And I noticed it first in the absence of assumption, in the way conversations were approached, with more care, more attention, as if every word now carried a weight that had not been considered before. My son called less frequently at first, not out of distance, but out of recalibration. And when he did speak, his tone had changed in ways that did not require explanation. There was no longer that underlying certainty, that quiet authority he had once carried so easily, only a measured awareness that reflected something newly understood. Laura, in her own way, adapted even more visibly. Not through apology, not through overt acknowledgement, but through behavior. The subtle shift in posture, in tone, in the way she addressed me, no longer from a position of assumed control, but from a place that recognized boundaries she had not seen before. We gathered again, some time later. Not for a formal purpose, not to revisit what had happened, but simply because that is what families do. And as we sat together, the atmosphere was different, not strained, not forced, but defined, as if everyone present understood, without needing to say it, that something fundamental had been clarified. Conversation moved easily enough. Familiar topics, shared updates, but beneath it all, there was a quiet precision now, an unspoken agreement, that certain assumptions no longer existed, that certain roles had been seen clearly and could not be redefined by casual words or misplaced confidence. I watched my son as he spoke, noticing the way he chose his words more carefully, the way he paused slightly before certain statements, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, and I understood that what had changed for him was not just the information he had seen, but the position he now recognized himself to be in. Laura met my gaze more directly than before, not with challenge, not with hesitation, but with acknowledgement, the kind that does not need to be verbalized to be understood. And in that acknowledgement, I saw that the shift within her had settled fully into place. Not comfortably, perhaps, but completely. I did not lead the conversation, did not guide it toward any conclusion, because there was nothing left to conclude. Everything had already been established, and what remained was not resolution, but continuation. This steady movement forward within a structure that had never changed. When the evening came to an end, there were no lingering questions, no attempts to revisit the past, only a quiet acceptance that what had once been misunderstood had now been seen clearly, and that clarity required nothing further to maintain it. Later that night, as I stood once again by the window, the same stillness surrounding me, I thought briefly about that moment at the party, not with resentment, not with satisfaction, but with perspective. Because what had seemed like a defining moment had in truth only been a beginning. The point at which perception separated from reality. My son had believed he was revealing something about me, something that placed him above and me below, and in doing so, he had unknowingly revealed something far more significant about himself, something that could not remain hidden once it had been seen. I did not need to correct him then, and I did not need to remind him now, because truth, once fully revealed, does not rely on repetition. It remains where it is, shaping everything quietly, steadily, without the need for acknowledgement. And as I turned away from the window, the house settling once more into its familiar calm, I understood with complete certainty that nothing had been taken from me. Nothing had been restored. Everything had simply been seen for what it had always been. And that, more than anything else, was enough.